Armando Hasuringan, Biology and Medicine videos. Please make sure to subscribe, join the forum and group for the latest videos. Please visit Facebook, Armando Hasuringan. Please like, and here you can also ask questions, answer questions, and post some interesting things, including your artworks. And you can also change the quality settings to the highest one for the graphics. In this video, we'll talk about hydrochloric acid and how it is secreted, what regulates acid secretion in the stomach, and from this we'll see how peptic ulcers are formed and also why people have heartburns. Finally, we will see what drugs can be used to help with these conditions. We will begin by looking at the gastrointestinal tract, starting from the esophagus, which comes down from the mouth and connects to the stomach. The stomach then connects to the duodenum of the small intestines. The stomach produces 2.5 liters of gastric juice per day. Because of this, the lumen of the stomach, the inside of the stomach, is very acidic, about a pH between 1 and 2. The esophageal sphincter is a barrier between the acidic stomach and the esophagus to prevent the acid from going back towards the esophagus. And the pylorus sphincter is the barrier between the acidic stomach and the duodenum. We would not want acid from the stomach to go into the duodenum or the esophagus, otherwise it might cause some uncomfortable conditions. Acid that is secreted by the stomach helps in food digestion. Acid in the stomach is secreted as hydrochloric acid. Let's have a look at the cells of the stomach and where hydrochloric acid comes from, and look at the overall picture of how hydrochloric acid secretion is regulated. Here we have the section of the stomach. It can be divided into three main layers: the mucosa on top, the submucosa, and the smooth muscle, which is meant to be a lot bigger than depicted on this diagram. And also we have a serosa layer, but that's not drawn. The submucosa contains the vein and arteries to deliver and return blood to the liver. The stomach have crypts where different stomach cells are. When we eat, our nerves send signals that cause the parietal cells to secrete hydrochloric acid, which is necessary for food digestion. Here. We also have enterochromaffin cells around this area, which secrete histamine. Histamine, in this case, promotes hydrochloric acid secretion by the parietal cells. There are also G cells. G cells are endocrine cells, which secrete gastrin, which also promote hydrochloric acid secretion by the parietal cells. Then we have another endocrine cell, the D cells. These cells secrete somatostatin. Somatostatin actually inhibits hydrochloric acid secretion by inhibiting the G cells from releasing gastrin, by inhibiting the parietal cells from secreting hydrochloric acid, and by inhibiting enterochromaffin cells to secrete histamine. Now, of course, there are other things that regulate hydrochloric acid secretion, and we'll look into it in more detail soon. Probably the most important cells in the gastrointestinal tract are the cells on the top. And these are regular epithelial cells, or the mucus cells, and they produce mucus, which helps protect the stomach from bacterial infection, as well as from the acidic environment of the stomach. Another type of cell worth mentioning in the stomach are the chief cells that secrete pepsinogen, necessary for protein digestion. Okay, let's have a closer look at how hydrochloric acid is secreted and how it is regulated by all these other cells and surrounding it. So here we have some stomach cells. We have the D cells, the G cells, and here we have the parietal cells. The parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid, remember. And then we have the mucus cells. Here we have the enterochromaffin cell, abbreviated ECL. The parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid into the lumen of the stomach, which is situated here through a proton pump sort of thing. The parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid by secreting hydrogen ion in exchange for potassium ion. And then it will secrete this potassium ion again together with chloride ion, thus forming hydrochloric acid in the stomach. Simple. HCl is hydrochloric acid and helps in food digestion. So what stimulates the process of secreting hydrochloric acid? Well, as we mentioned, ECl secretes histamine, which bind onto histamine 2-like receptors on the parietal cells, which will stimulate this whole process to secrete hydrochloric acid. The G cells, which are endocrine cells, will secrete gastrin into the bloodstream. From here, gastrin will bind onto gastrin receptors on ECl, which will stimulate histamine release, which will then stimulate hydrochloric acid secretion by parietal cells. Gastrin will also bind onto gastrin receptors on parietal cells, which will stimulate hydrochloric acid secretion. The vagus nerve, part of the parasympathetic nerve, innervating the stomach area, will secrete acetylcholine, which will bind onto muscarinic receptors on both parietal cells and enterochromatin cells, which will all promote hydrochloric acid secretion. So all these were promoting hydrochloric acid secretion. The cells and mechanisms that inhibit hydrochloric acid secretion include the hormone somatostatin, which is secreted by the D cells. So somatostatin inhibits basically the hydrochloric acid secretion. Also, inflammatory mediators such as prostaglandin E2 and prostaglandin I2, derived from arachidonic acid, inhibits hydrochloric acid secretion. Arachidonic acid, through the enzyme COX, can synthesize prostaglandin E2 and prostaglandin I2, which binds to prostaglandin receptors, which inhibit hydrochloric acid secretion by the parietal cells. Prostaglandin E2 and prostaglandin I2 also binds to and activate mucus cells to secrete mucus and bicarbonate. These are the most important substances that have a negative effect on hydrochloric acid in the lumen of the stomach, because mucus and bicarbonate essentially neutralize the acid, which prevents the acid from damaging the stomach itself. So mucus is very important in this respect. Now we know how hydrochloric acid is regulated and balanced in an overall general picture here. Let's see what happens when there's too much hydrochloric acid secretion, when there's just heaps of HCl's. Essentially, if there's too much hydrochloric acid being secreted and there's not enough defense against this acid, it can cause peptic ulcers. Let's zoom into this peptic ulcer. Here is a diagrammatic representation of a peptic ulcer. Here is the mucus layer, submucosa, the 3 muscle layers, and the serosa. Peptic ulcers are eroded areas of the mucosa caused by digestive juices and acid, which may be perforated or bleed. Peptic ulcers are particularly in the stomach, but ulcers can also occur anywhere along the gastrointestinal tract, including the duodenum. The pathophysiology of peptic ulcers are straightforward. If there is an infection by bacteria such as Helicobacter pylori, this can cause peptic ulcers. And of course, if there is an imbalance between mucus damaging products such as pepsinogen and hydrochloric acid and the protective products such as bicarbonate and mucus, this can cause hydrochloric acid. So if there's less mucus and there's more acid, of course you would damage the mucus layer, causing peptic ulcers. Now, causes of peptic ulcers can be induced by stress, smoking, and non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAID. Now you might think, how would NSAIDs possibly do this? Well, remember down here, prostaglandin E2 and prostaglandin I2 normally inhibit hydrochloric acid secretion. NSAIDs work by inhibiting the enzyme COX, which is responsible for making prostaglandin E2 and prostaglandin I2. So if we inhibit the synthesis of these prostaglandins, it would mean that more hydrochloric acid can be secreted, which can cause peptic ulcers. Another condition that can arise from acid, too much acid, or acid itself, is a phenomenon known as heartburns, which don't actually involve any heart damage, or maybe, but it doesn't. It's actually better called acid gastric reflux. Gastric acid reflux is when we have backflow of stomach content, acid, upwards towards the esophagus. The esophagus lacks the protective lining of the stomach, therefore acid reflux can cause pain, inflammation, and damage. GORD, also known as gastric esophageal reflux disease, is an extreme case of gastric acid reflux. Some people call it GERD because different English-speaking countries require different abbreviations, which is ridiculous. Anyways, GORD can be associated with certain food, medication, or conditions. And in gastric acid reflux, they can cause the phenomenon heartburn, and this can occur as much as 20% in the GORD cases. So gastric acid reflux up the esophagus can cause heartburn. The pathophysiology of GORD is not fully understood, but it's most probably due to the disturbance in normal gastric reflux barrier, or the weakening of the esophageal sphincter, which is the barrier between the acidic stomach and the esophagus. Okay, so now that we know about gastric acid reflux and peptic ulcers, how would we treat it? Well, we can either neutralize the acid or prevent the acid from being secreted. We can use antacids, such as a combination of magnesium and aluminium salts, which will neutralize the gastric acid, hydrochloric acid, and hence raise the pH. Raising the pH to about 3 will neutralize most of the acid. Antacids are usually short acting. So that's neutralizing the hydrochloric acid. But we can also prevent hydrochloric acid from being secreted. For example, the proton pump inhibitors that end in prazole, such as omeprazole, will irreversibly bind with and block proton pumps. These are well tolerated, effective, and has a long-lasting effect. There are also histamine 2 blockers, such as cimetidine, which inhibits all histamine 2 receptors. Therefore, they have a shorter action duration than proton pump inhibitors, and they are found to have more of an affinity to block H2 receptors in the stomach, even though there are H2 receptors all over the body. We can also inhibit the actions of acetylcholine from the parasympathetic nerve endings by using atropine, but these have problems in itself. So I hope you enjoyed the physiology, the disease, and pharmacology video on gastric acids. Thank you for watching.